The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape of Amiens like a shroud, but beneath its ghostly veil, something extraordinary was stirring. It was August 8, 1918, and the Canadian Corps, along with their Australian allies, crouched in their trenches, hearts pounding with anticipation. This would be the day that changed everything, the beginning of what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive, Canada's most decisive contribution to the Great War. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Currie adjusted his field glasses and peered across no man's land. The German lines, which had seemed impenetrable for so long, suddenly appeared vulnerable. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was demoralized, their reserves stretched thin after 4 years of brutal warfare. The Canadian Corps, now battle-hardened and supremely confident, was about to unleash a coordinated assault that would shatter the Western Front's deadlock. As dawn broke over the Somme Valley, the earth trembled beneath the weight of over 600 tanks rumbling forward. The Canadian 4th Division, positioned on the right flank, moved with mechanical precision. These were no longer the eager volunteers who had sailed from Halifax in 1914. They were seasoned warriors who had survived Vimy Ridge past Bimdel and countless other hellish engagements. The German machine gun nests, which had claimed so many Allied lives in previous offensives, fell silent one by one as Canadian infantry advanced with calculated aggression. Private William Johnston from New Brunswick found himself face to face with a German officer who seemed barely older than himself. The enemy soldier's eyes reflected not hatred, but exhaustion, a weariness that spoke of an army on the brink of collapse. By midday, the Canadian Corps had advanced 8 miles, capturing the strategic town of Rosières-en Santerre. German prisoners streamed past in unprecedented numbers, their grey uniforms dusty and torn. Many seemed almost relieved to be captured, their faces bearing the hollow look of men who had endured too much. The psychological impact of this breakthrough rippled through both armies like wildfire. General Currie, observing the unprecedented success from his forward command post, realized they had achieved something remarkable. According to historical accounts documented by the Canadian War Museum, this single day's advance equaled what had taken months to accomplish in earlier campaigns. The German High Command, witnessing their carefully constructed defensive lines crumbling, began to contemplate the unthinkable defeat. As evening approached, Canadian engineers worked feverishly to consolidate their gains. Telephone lines were strung across the newly captured territory. Artillery pieces were repositioned, and supply lines extended to support the advancing troops. The logistics of modern warfare had finally caught up with tactical innovation. Success at Amiens sent shockwaves through the German military hierarchy. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German forces opposite the Canadians, reported to his superiors that his army was severely shaken by the ferocity and effectiveness of the assault. The psychological momentum was shifting decisively in favor of the Allies. In the gathering darkness, Canadian soldiers dug new positions and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. But something had fundamentally changed on August 8. The German army, which had seemed invincible just hours before, now appeared mortal. The 100 Days Offensive had begun, and with it, the final chapter of the Great War was being written by Canadian hands. The success at Amiens was merely the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that would echo across the Western Front for the next 100 days. By August 15, 1918, the Canadian Corps had pushed the German army back nearly 20 miles, but their greatest test lay ahead: the formidable Hindenburg Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable defensive barrier. Sergeant Major Robert McLeod of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. The Hindenburg Line represented everything the German military engineers had learned about defensive warfare: concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and multiple layers of barbed wire, stretched across the landscape like a medieval fortress reimagined for the industrial age. The German High Command had invested enormous resources in this defensive system, believing it would hold back any Allied advance indefinitely. General Erich von Falkenhayn himself had proclaimed that the line was impregnable, a boast that would soon be tested by Canadian ingenuity and determination. On September 2nd, the Canadian Corps received orders to spearhead the assault on the Drocourt-Quinte line, a crucial section of the Hindenburg system. The task seemed impossible. Previous Allied attacks against similar fortifications had resulted in catastrophic casualties with minimal gains, but the Canadians had developed new tactics, refined through bitter experience and innovative thinking. Captain James Morrison, a former schoolteacher from Toronto, led his company through a detailed rehearsal of the upcoming assault. They practiced coordinating infantry advances with artillery barrages, using precise timing to maximize effectiveness while minimizing friendly fire casualties. The creeping barrage technique, perfected by Canadian artillery officers, would provide a moving wall of explosive protection as the infantry advanced. The assault began at dawn on September 3rd, with over 700 Canadian artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously. The sound was deafening, a continuous thunder that could be heard 50 miles away. German defenders huddled in their concrete shelters felt the earth shake as high explosive shells systematically destroyed their defensive positions. Following Closely behind the artillery barrage, Canadian infantry moved forward in small, flexible groups. They had learned to exploit gaps in the enemy's defenses rather than attacking strengths directly. When they encountered resistance, they bypassed it and allowed follow-up units to deal with isolated strongpoints. This tactical evolution represented a profound shift from the rigid linear attacks of earlier war years. By noon, the 22nd Battalion, composed primarily of French-Canadian soldiers, had penetrated the first line of German defenses. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Tremblay, reported that enemy resistance was sporadic and disorganized. The German defenders, subjected to months of constant pressure, were showing signs of psychological breakdown. The breakthrough came at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Major Harold Wilson's battalion discovered a gap in the German wire. Exploiting this opening with characteristic Canadian audacity, they poured through and established a foothold behind the main defensive line. German reserves, rushing to contain the breach, found themselves under attack from multiple directions, as documented in the official history published by the Department of National Defense. The Canadian Corps captured over 5,000 German prisoners in a single day, along with dozens of artillery pieces and machine guns. The psychological impact was devastating. The supposedly impregnable Hindenburg line had been breached by colonial troops whom German propaganda had dismissed as amateur soldiers. General Ludendorff, receiving reports of the Canadian breakthrough, purportedly flew into a rage. The failure of the Hindenburg line meant that Germany's last hope for a negotiated peace from a position of strength was rapidly evaporating. The Canadian Corps, once considered a minor component of the British war effort, had become the sharp edge of Allied victory. The collapse of the Hindenburg line marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in the very nature of warfare itself. By September 15, 1918, the Canadian Corps found itself advancing through German territory that had been untouched by combat for 4 years. The psychological transformation was remarkable. Soldiers who had spent years measuring progress in yards were now advancing miles each day. Private Thomas Anderson from Manitoba wrote to his family describing the surreal experience of marching through abandoned German positions. "The enemy has left everything behind," he reported, "ammunition, food, even personal belongings. It's as if they simply vanished into the morning mist." This mass abandonment of equipment and positions indicated a demoralization that went far beyond tactical withdrawal. The German army, which had appeared invincible just months earlier, was now in full retreat. Canadian advance patrols reported encountering entire German units surrendering without a fight. The rigid discipline that had characterized the German military machine was crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance. Colonel Andrew McNaughton, commanding the Canadian artillery, observed that his guns were advancing so rapidly that ammunition supply had become a greater challenge than enemy resistance. The logistics of victory, it seemed, were more complex than the logistics of stalemate. Supply lines stretched across devastated countryside, and engineers worked around the clock to repair bridges and roads destroyed by the retreating Germans. On September 27, the Canadian Corps liberated the city of Cambrai, a strategic railroad junction that had been in German hands since 1914. The civilian population, emerging from years of occupation, greeted the Canadian soldiers with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Children who had never known life without German soldiers running through the streets, offering what little food they had to their liberators. The liberation of Cambrai revealed the true cost of German occupation. Mayor Henry Dubois, who had secretly maintained records throughout the war, documented systematic looting of cultural artifacts, forced labor, and the deportation of young men to German factories. The Canadian soldiers, witnessing these conditions firsthand, fought with renewed determination to end the conflict decisively. Intelligence reports indicated that the German army was conducting a fighting retreat, but the emphasis was clearly on retreat rather than fighting. German commanders, recognizing the futility of their situation, were more concerned with preserving their forces for a potential defense of the homeland than with mounting effective resistance in France. The Canadian Corps advance was so rapid that they frequently outpaced their own supply lines. Soldiers subsisted on captured German rations and equipment, an ironic reversal of the situation that had prevailed for most of the war. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. The Canadians gained confidence from their success, while German morale continued to deteriorate. By October 1, the Canadian Corps had advanced over 40 miles from their starting positions. At Amiens, this represented more territorial gain than the entire British expeditionary force had achieved in the previous 3 years combined. The strategic implications were staggering. The German army in northern France was on the verge of complete collapse. General Currie, observing the unprecedented success of his forces, he began to contemplate the possibility that the war might end before winter. Historical accounts from the Imperial War Museum suggest that Allied commanders had initially planned for the conflict to continue well into 1919, but the speed of the German collapse was exceeding all expectations. The rapid advance created new challenges for the Canadian Corps. Communication lines were stretched to the breaking point, and coordinating attacks across such a wide front required unprecedented levels of staff work. But these were problems of success rather than failure. Challenges that Canadian military leadership met with characteristic adaptability and determination. October 19, 1918 dawned grey and cold across the Belgian countryside, but the Canadian Corps pressed forward with an urgency born of approaching victory. The city of Valenciennes lay ahead, its medieval walls and industrial infrastructure representing one of the last German strongholds in northern France. The Battle of Valenciennes would become the final major engagement of the 100 Days Offensive, a climactic confrontation that would test Canadian resolve one last time. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie stood before his divisional commanders in a hastily erected command tent, his weathered face reflecting the strain of months of continuous combat. The intelligence reports spread across the table told a story of German desperation. The enemy had concentrated their remaining reserves in Valenciennes, determined to make their final stand count. The German commander, General Friedrich von Lossberg, had earned a reputation as a defensive specialist during the long years of trench warfare. His forces, though depleted, still controlled the high ground around Valenciennes, and had turned the city into a fortress. Machine gun nests commanded every approach, and artillery pieces were positioned to create devastating crossfire patterns across the surrounding countryside. Captain Robert Bell, a decorated veteran of Vimy Ridge, studied the aerial reconnaissance photographs with professional interest. The German defensive positions were formidable, but they lacked the depth and sophistication of the Hindenburg Line. More importantly, the defenders showed signs of the same demoralization that had characterized German resistance throughout the offensive. The Canadian assault began at dawn on October 25 with the now familiar pattern of massed artillery preparation. But this time, the bombardment was different, more precise, more focused on specific targets rather than general area destruction. Canadian artillery officers had learned to coordinate their fire with surgical precision, maximizing damage to enemy positions while minimizing destruction of civilian infrastructure. The 1st Canadian Division, commanded by Brigadier General Archibald MacDonell, spearheaded the assault from the south. Their advance was methodical and professional, reflecting years of combat experience and tactical evolution. Gone were the desperate frontal assaults of earlier war years. In their place was a sophisticated integration of infantry, artillery and engineering forces. German resistance was fierce but localized. Individual strongpoints fought with desperate courage, but the overall defensive system lacked coordination. Communications between German units had been disrupted by the preliminary bombardment, and reserves were insufficient to mount effective counterattacks. The psychological impact of months of continuous retreat was evident in the defenders' inability to maintain cohesive resistance. By noon, Canadian forces had penetrated the outer defensive perimeter and were fighting in the streets of Valenciennes itself. Urban warfare presented unique challenges. Every building could conceal enemy soldiers, and civilian casualties were a constant concern. Canadian commanders, mindful of their responsibilities to the civilian population, modified their tactics to minimize collateral damage. The breakthrough came when the 3rd Canadian Division, exploiting a gap in the German lines, reached the city center and captured the main railway station. This severed the German garrison's last supply line and effectively cut off their retreat. Isolated and surrounded, German resistance began to collapse rapidly, as referenced in the official war diary of the Canadian Corps. Over 2,000 German prisoners were captured during the Battle of Valenciennes, along with significant quantities of artillery and equipment. The city's liberation marked not just a tactical victory, but a symbolic triumph. The Canadian Corps had successfully concluded its role in the war's final offensive. General von Lossberg, observing the collapse of his final defensive position, reportedly commented to his staff that the Canadian assault had been conducted with a professionalism that would have been impossible 4 years ago. The colonial troops had evolved into one of the most effective fighting forces on the Western Front. The ancient Belgian city of Mons held a special significance in the mythology of the Great War. It was here, in August 1914, that the British Expeditionary Force had fought its first major engagement against the German army. Now, in November 1918, it would witness the war's final chapter as the Canadian Corps advanced through its historic streets. The irony was not lost on Captain William Price, a veteran of the Canadian Engineers who had studied the early campaigns in military college. The war that had begun with British forces retreating from Mons would end with Canadian forces liberating the same city. The symbolic weight of this moment was palpable among the troops as they prepared for what everyone sensed would be their final battle. German resistance around Mons was sporadic and disorganized. The enemy army, which had once seemed invincible, was now a shadow of its former self. Desertion rates had skyrocketed, and many German units were at less than half strength. The psychological collapse that had begun with the failure of the spring offensive was now complete. On November 7, advance elements of the Canadian Corps reached the outskirts of Mons. The city's population, which had endured over 4 years of German occupation, began to emerge from their homes as rumors of liberation spread. Children, many of whom had never known life without foreign soldiers, watched in wonder as Canadian troops moved through their streets. The final German defenders withdrew from Mons during the night of November 10th, leaving behind a city that bore the scars of long occupation but remained essentially intact. Belgian civilians, emerging from years of oppression, greeted the Canadian liberators with a mixture of joy and disbelief. The war was effectively over. Though the formal armistice would not be signed until the following morning, Private Joseph Lebel from Quebec found himself among the first Canadian soldiers to enter the city centre. The Grande Place, with its medieval guildhouses and Gothic bell tower, had witnessed centuries of European history. Now it was witnessing the end of the most destructive war in human history, and Canadian soldiers were playing the leading role in its conclusion. The liberation of Mons represented more than just another military objective captured. It symbolized the transformation of the Canadian Corps from a collection of volunteer militia units into one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. The journey from the disaster of Second Ypres in 1915 to the triumph of Mons in 1918 represented an evolution in military professionalism that few armies had achieved. General Currie, entering the city on the morning of November 11th, was greeted by Mayor Adolphe Max, who had secretly maintained records of the German occupation. The mayor's documentation, as later reported in the Belgian historical journal Revue Belgique d'Histoire Militaire, revealed the systematic nature of German exploitation and the remarkable resilience of the civilian population. The formal armistice came into effect at 11 o'clock on November 11, 1918. As the news spread through the Canadian positions around Mons, soldiers who had endured years of unimaginable hardship began to comprehend that they had survived. The silence that followed the last artillery barrage was deafening, a quiet that many veterans would later describe as the most profound sound they had ever heard. Church bells throughout Belgium began to ring at the appointed hour, their bronze voices carrying across the battlefield where so many had fallen. The bells of Mons, silent for over 4 years, joined the chorus of celebration that swept across Europe. The Great War was over, and the Canadian Corps had played a decisive role in its conclusion. The cost of victory was staggering. The Canadian Corps had suffered over 60,000 casualties during the 100 Days Offensive, but their sacrifice had helped bring about the end of a conflict that had consumed an entire generation. The transformation of Canada from a colonial dependency to a recognized military power was complete, sealed by the blood and courage of ordinary men who had done extraordinary things. The morning after the armistice brought an eerie silence to the battlefield around Mons. Canadian soldiers, accustomed to the constant thunder of artillery and the rattle of machine guns, found themselves adjusting to a quiet that seemed almost supernatural. The war was over, but the cost of victory was written in the faces of every man who had survived the 100 Days Offensive. Captain Thomas McPherson, a medical officer with the Canadian Corps, walked through the field hospitals that had been established in the liberated territory. The wounded lay on stretchers, some sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, others staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of men who had seen too much. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological scars would remain with these soldiers for the rest of their lives. The statistical summary of Canadian casualties during the 100 Days Offensive made for sobering reading. Over 20,000 men had been killed or wounded in the advance from Amiens to Mons-sur-Price. That represented nearly a quarter of the Corps' total strength. Each number represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future that would never be realized. Yet the achievements of the Canadian Corps during those final months were undeniable. They had advanced over 100 miles, captured thousands of German prisoners, and liberated dozens of French and Belgian communities. More importantly, they had played a crucial role in breaking the psychological will of the German army and forcing the armistice that ended the war. The transformation of the Canadian Corps from a colonial militia into a professional military force was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their wartime experience. The volunteers who had sailed from Halifax in 1914 bore little resemblance to the battle-hardened veterans who marched through Mons in November 1918. They had learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable and had emerged as masters of their profession. General Arthur Currie, reflecting on the Corps' achievements, wrote in his personal diary that the Canadian success had been built on 3 foundations: superior training, innovative tactics, and the unique character of the Canadian soldier. The colonial troops had brought a flexibility and adaptability to warfare that their European counterparts often lacked. The human cost of the 100 Days Offensive extended far beyond the battlefield casualties. Entire communities across Canada had been devastated by the loss of their young men. The farming villages of Saskatchewan, the fishing ports of Nova Scotia, the lumber towns of British Columbia all had contributed their sons to the Corps, and all had paid a terrible price for victory. Private William Henderson from Ontario, one of the fortunate survivors, wrote to his parents describing the mixed emotions that accompanied the armistice. "We have won," he reported, "but the cost has been so great that victory feels hollow. Too many good men will never see home again, and those of us who survive will carry the weight of their sacrifice forever." The German army that surrendered in November 1918 was a broken force, demoralized and defeated. But the victory had been purchased with blood and suffering on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. The Industrial Revolution had transformed warfare into a machine of unprecedented destruction, and the Canadian Corps had mastered that, the machine at enormous cost. The liberation of French and Belgian territory revealed the true nature of German occupation. Villages had been systematically looted, civilians subjected to forced labor, and cultural artifacts destroyed or removed to Germany. The Canadian soldiers, witnessing these conditions firsthand, gained a deeper understanding of what they had been fighting for. As documented in the official history compiled by the Canadian War Records Office. The 100 Days Offensive had demonstrated that the stalemate of trench warfare could be broken through superior tactics, coordination, and leadership. The Canadian Corps had shown the world that colonial troops could not only match but exceed the performance of European armies. The victory celebrations in the liberated territories were bittersweet. While civilians rejoiced at their freedom, the Canadian soldiers who had made that freedom possible were already contemplating the long journey home and the challenge of rebuilding their lives in peacetime. The war was over, but its consequences would echo through the decades to come. The steamship carrying the survivors of the Canadian Corps pulled away from the docks of Le Havre on a grey morning in February 1919. The men lining the rails looked back at the French coast with complex emotions, relief at leaving the battlefields behind, but also a profound sense of loss for comrades who would never make this journey home. Sergeant Major Robert Fraser, a veteran of every major Canadian engagement from Vimy Ridge to Mons, stood among his men and reflected on the transformation they had all undergone. The eager volunteers who had sailed from Halifax 5 years earlier had been replaced by professional soldiers who had mastered the deadliest form of warfare in human history. The cost of that education had been measured in blood and suffering, but the lessons learned would shape military doctrine for generations. The impact of the 100 Days Offensive on Canadian national identity was profound and lasting. The Dominion had entered the war as a colonial dependency, contributing troops to a British war effort. It emerged as a recognized military power, with a seat at the peace negotiations and a voice in international affairs. The sacrifice of the Canadian Corps had purchased not just victory, but nationhood itself. The tactical innovations developed by the Canadian Corps during the 100 Days would influence military thinking well into the 20th century. The integration of infantry, artillery, and engineering forces, the use of flexible small unit tactics, the emphasis on training and preparation all became standard elements of modern military doctrine. The colonial troops had taught the world how to fight and win in the industrial age. Colonel Andrew McNaughton, who had commanded the Canadian artillery with such distinction, would later write that the 100 Days Offensive represented the coming of age of Canadian military professionalism. The Corps had evolved from a collection of amateur volunteers into one of the most effective fighting forces in the world, capable of independent operations and strategic planning. The human cost of this achievement was staggering and permanent. Over 60,000 Canadian soldiers had died during the war, with the majority falling during the final months of fighting. The 100 Days Offensive, while militarily successful, had consumed an entire generation of young men whose potential would never be realized. The victory had been purchased at a price that would haunt Canadian society for decades. The liberated territories of France and Belgium bore witness to the effectiveness of Canadian military operations. Towns and villages that had been devastated by 4 years of warfare were restored to civilian control, their populations free to rebuild their lives. The Canadian Corps had not merely defeated the German army, they had restored hope to millions of European civilians who had endured years of occupation and oppression. The psychological impact of the 100 Days Offensive on the German army was perhaps as significant as its tactical success. The systematic destruction of German defensive positions, the capture of thousands of prisoners, and the relentless advance of Canadian forces had broken the will of an army that had seemed invincible just months earlier. The colonial troops had achieved what years of European warfare had failed to accomplish. The legacy of the 100 Days Offensive extended far beyond the immediate military victory. It established Canada as a significant player in international affairs, demonstrated the effectiveness of professional military training, and proved that colonial forces could equal or exceed the performance of European armies. The price of these achievements was measured in human suffering, but the lessons learned would shape the future of warfare and international relations. As referenced in the comprehensive study published by the Canadian War Museum, the 100 Days Offensive represented the culmination of Canadian military evolution during the Great War. The corps that had struggled through the early disasters of the conflict had emerged as a force capable of independent strategic operations and decisive tactical victories. The men who survived the 100 Days Offensive would carry its lessons for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the transformation of warfare from a gentleman's pursuit to an industrial process, and they had mastered that process at enormous personal cost. Their sacrifice had not only ended the Great War but had also established the foundation for Canada's emergence as a modern nation with a voice in world affairs. The bells of Mons, which had rung out to celebrate the armistice, continued to toll. For the thousands of Canadian soldiers who would never return home, Their sacrifice had purchased victory, but the cost would be remembered long after the details of tactical movements and strategic objectives had faded from memory. The 100 Days Offensive had ended the war, but its legacy would endure as long as Canada existed as a nation.